This miniature was primed with an airbrush using Vallejo's US Olive Drab Primer, followed by a zenithal spray of German Dark Yellow. I had already done the cleanup of mold lines, or so I thought, but the priming showed that there were some bad spots that I did not do a good enough job on, so I take the time to remove them now. I do not go back to the airbrush and redo the priming stage, however, instead just seal what I have with gloss varnish. The varnish will not fix all of the unevenness where the primer was scraped off, along with the mold lines, but it'll help a little. With the varnish fully dried, I start with Goddess Glow Speed Paint that I thin with a lot of Speed Paint Medium. I wanted the green and yellow of the primers to help influence the skin, but I didn't want her looking green or yellow. However, this mixture did little to tone down her incredible hulkness, so I repeated this with a more substantial 1-to-1 mix after the first application had finished drying. Once I was sure the speed paint was fully dried, I began adding highlights. The speed paint had left some splotchy spots, so nearly all of my highlights will be added with repeated glazes. Each color of the flesh highlights will be added 3 to 5 times as needed before moving to the next color. I also ensure that after each application of the glazes, enough time has passed for it to fully dry to reduce the likelihood of me tearing specks of it away. Like the first highlight, the exact same steps are taken for the second, though I reduce the area covered somewhat, adding the highlights where I feel an overhead sun should shine upon the most. Though I add this glaze multiple times, I try to slightly reduce the area of each new application to help build a more gradual transition to the brighter areas. At least that's the idea I had in my head. I'm still pretty inexperienced with glazing, but I'm a lot better now than I was this time last year. The third highlight simply follows the same pattern, 3 to 5 applications, letting each application fully dry, and then covering slightly less area each time. Once this painfully slow series of highlights are completed, I do them all over again, following the same steps. And as I get through to the last highlight in the second pass through, the skin starts looking markedly better. I had the thought as I got to this point during the video editing that glazing is probably going to be like the rule of thumb someone once told me about how much tinder you need to start a fire. And that was to gather how much you think you need, and then go get 3 times that amount. That, or maybe I'll try a pyramid system, like 5 applications of each color, then 4, then 3, then 2, and then 1. I'm sure that ultimately it'll boil down to the more glazing that's done, the better the result, but these are just things to try in future projects. I add some dark transparent brown ink to add darker shadows next. This was only applied in 1 application. Magenta is then glazed between the darker areas and the mid-tone to help add some warmth, also applied over 1 application. I then reapply the brightest highlight that I had used previously around the upper parts of the body that would receive the most light over 2 to 5 applications. I then repeat the magenta and brightest highlight color again to finish off the flesh. When I'm doing flesh in this manner, it's a lot of tedious thin applications of a color and then a lot of back and forth between them. I move next to the bikini top, base coating it with a mix of a black and green first. Just to note that in this video I'll not be covering the shorts, as it just follows the same steps I did in my previous video for a Dust 1947 miniature. That link can be found in the top right corner of your screen now, as well as in the description. The converse of that video is also true, where some parts of the previous miniature will have shared steps covered in this video, such as the leathers and base. I purposely painted these two together and using similar elements, as this not only helps me save some wasted paint from my palette, but also helps limit the amount of steps in each video, keeping the average runtime lower. The bikini top is small and is the only green clothing, so I keep it fairly simple, adding a highlight of Hooker's green followed by a highlight of Hooker's green mixed with a much brighter green. I then finish it off with a very minute highlight of said much brighter green. The leather boots are done next from a mixture of red and dark brown as a base coat. I add a blocky shadow using red and a dark purple mixed together. A highlight of the same red used in both the base coat and shadow is now used as the first highlight, though I have to be careful to leave a little of the base color on the belt due to how narrow it is. This highlight is added only as an edge highlight as well as scratchy hatching lines all over. Using my best brush with the finest tip, I apply the next highlight, a mix of red and a light tannish brown, and I paint a finer edge highlight and finer scratches via hatching lines, but these are only added to where the light would catch the most. I finish off the leather parts by adding a touch of transparent dark brown ink where the shadows would be the strongest. Moving on to the hair, I base coat it with a dark brown followed by a highlight of a slightly lighter brown, covering roughly 75% of the full surface area. The second highlight will cover about 50% of the surface area and focusing more towards the crown of the head, leaving the lower parts of the hair and the center part alone. A third highlight is added to cover about 30% of the remaining area, and again focusing towards the crown of the head, since this will be where the light would hit the hair the hardest, assuming an overhead source. A final highlight of an off-white is added to roughly 10 to 15% of the hair. This last highlight I also worked down in between some of the sculpted strands. I then finish the hair by mixing a glaze from a dark brown and add this to the lower areas and the part to help ease the transitions there. I didn't use the transparent brown ink as that would have been too dark for what I wanted. What I believe to be an M18 Recoilless Rifle is base coated with Vallejo's aluminum before a touch of Army Painter's dark tone wash is added. I only dab a small amount around the recesses to add some depth, and I do not slap it over the entire gun. Instead, the slapping all over is reserved for a vibrant pink speed paint. Once fully dried, I then return to the aluminum paint used for the base coat, and I apply this as edge highlights. I add a few scratches here and there as well, but only a few, as I'll be returning to add the same metallic scratching again later. Since we have a pink M18, and I was in a mood to paint random graffiti-esque things on this miniature and the one that preceded it, I go with a very well-known figure, Hello Kitty. This I sketch out in black before adding a red bow. Then I sketch out the letters along the front of the M18's barrel, and then I add a couple more scratches, some over the graffiti to help reinforce that it was painted onto the gun and has worn off. I then call the gun done and focus on the base, with the finish line now in sight. The base was quick and dirty and followed the same recipe I've been doing on my mercenary bases for a while now, so they all have a matching theme. First, I add some AK Interactive Muddy Ground texture paste, and once dry, I base coat the rim black and paint the dirt a dirty mustard brown. Once all of that is dry, I then slap on some strong tone wash and again wait until that has fully dried. I next apply 2 highlights with increasingly brighter mustard yellows, and they're applied in a stippling dab or light dry brushing strokes. The final highlight is done with a mix of yellow and off-white and applied very sparingly and only on the highest parts of the ground where the light would reach the most. Lastly, I scrape some various colors of chalk with the back of my X-Acto knife to create some dust, and I stipple this on with a dry brush, careful to not jab too hard and tear up any layers of paint. With a slightly damp brush, I go back and clean off the rim of the base, and then I call it a night. And this is where I stopped. My favorite part of the miniature is the hair and my attempt at painting a closed eye, which is oddly something I never did before. It isn't the greatest by any stretch, but I'm still happy enough with how it came out. I did like how the boots came out with the scratches I painted on, but in the end result, most of these scratches are dulled down greatly by the chalk dust, to the point that I could have just not bothered with it in the first place. I also really like how the glazing came out on the front of her right leg and the outside of her left thigh. When I say right and left, I mean her physical right and left, and not right and left from a viewer's perspective. For lessons learned, my graffiti is not good. I think I have good ideas for it, but the execution is lacking, though I'm not disheartened by it. The main issue is lack of experience due to not doing this kind of thing. I should have painted white for the Hello Kitty head first, and then outlined it in black and added the eyes and nose. The text should have been painted more along the length of the barrel and not angled like I did. As it is, you have to rotate the miniature to read it all easily, versus being able to see it in passing. For more practice, I think I might do a few futuristic miniatures this year and do some cyberpunk-esque graffiti on parts of the background. That way I can do a lot of it on just a few miniatures versus trying to do a little on a bunch of miniatures and end up making it an unwelcome reoccurring thing on this channel. And that'll bring this video to its end. I hope you learned something or inspired to start your own World War II themed soldier with graffiti from an era that hasn't happened yet. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, you can easily support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Jim with Wargaming Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.